Lord Fenwick spread the documents across the desk and smiled. Everything. The manor, the land, the accounts, all of it, in her name by Friday. Upstairs, in the East Wing bedroom of Pembroke Manor, Duke Alaric lay completely still. He could not move his hands. He could not turn his head. He could not make a single sound, but his eyes were open, and he could hear every single word. The carriage crash had been 3 days ago. The physician had declared his mind gone, destroyed beyond recovery. The servants believed it. The solicitors believed it. Isolde believed it most of all. She walked into his bedroom that evening, sat beside him, took his limp hand in both of hers, and laughed. Not the soft, grieving laugh of a devoted wife, the long, relieved laugh of a woman who has been waiting for something for a very long time. "It's finally over," she whispered. She had no idea. He heard everything. He remembered everything. And when he was ready, he would make sure she remembered this moment too. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now, because what this man does next, nobody sees coming. Subscribe. This one will leave you speechless. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It came down in heavy, punishing curtains across the Pembroke moors, turning the North Road into a river of black mud and bending the old yews along the gorge so severely that travelers who knew that road well had chosen, that evening, to stay home. Duke Alaric Pembroke was not the kind of man who stayed home. He sat inside his carriage with a folded letter in his breast pocket, correspondence from a London banker that contained numbers he was still turning over in his mind, and watched the darkness slide past the window. He was not worried. He had ridden the North Road 100 times. He trusted his coachman, trusted his horses, trusted the iron reliability of a well-maintained carriage. He trusted too much. The sound came from beneath the floor, a single crack, sharp and surgical, the sound of something engineered to fail at exactly this moment, on exactly this bend, above exactly this gorge. The horses screamed, the carriage lurched. For one suspended, horrible second, the whole world tilted sideways, and then it dropped. When they pulled Alaric from the wreckage 4 hours later, the coachman was dead, and the Duke could not feel his legs. He was carried to Pembroke Manor and laid in the East Wing. Dr. Stowell arrived at first light with a grave face that Alaric would later recognize as a performance, and delivered his verdict in the measured tones of a man who has decided what the outcome will be before he has examined the patient. "The spine, Your Grace. The damage is significant. We must be patient. We must pray." He prescribed a tonic for nerve inflammation, small brown bottle, twice daily. Alaric obediently drank it. His wife, Duchess Isolde, wept at his bedside with extraordinary elegance. She was the kind of woman whose grief looked better than most people's happiness. Eyes glistening just enough, hands folded in her lap with the composure of someone who had rehearsed sorrow and found it suited her. She administered the medicine herself, every morning and every evening, tilting the glass to Alaric's lips with devoted gentleness. The medicine tasted of anise and something underneath, something metallic and bitter that clung to his throat like a warning he could not yet name. "All medicine tastes dreadful," Isolde said when he mentioned it. She smoothed his blanket and smiled. "It is simply the price of healing, my love." She kissed his forehead and left. Alaric lay in the silence and stared at the ceiling. He was a man who had survived drought, litigation, a fever in Calcutta, and a father with a talent for impossible demands. He was not built for simple acceptance, and what he was accepting right now, the clean crack of the axle, the taste of the medicine, the rehearsed grief on his wife's face, did not sit quietly inside him. It paced, it scratched, it insisted on being examined. The axle had not simply broken.
He had heard breaks before. They were ragged, grinding things. This had been one single crack, deliberate as a pistol shot. On the fifth night, when the house had gone dark and quiet, he heard voices from the study directly below his bedroom. Isolde's voice, low and unburdened, and a man's, Lord Fenwick, her second cousin by marriage, a man who had always toured the Pembroke grounds with acquisitive eyes of someone calculating what things were worth. He could not hear the words, but he heard Isolde laugh. Not the controlled, decorative laugh she used in society. Something looser, something that belonged to a woman who believed her obstacles were almost cleared. Alaric did not sleep that night. He lay perfectly still and began with tremendous patience to plan.
Crispin Ware had served Alaric Pembroke for 19 years. He had followed him to 3 countries, pulled him from one ill-advised fight, nursed him through a fever that the Calcutta doctor had not expected him to survive, and kept confidences that would have unsettled several powerful families. He was a compact man, gray-eyed, utterly unremarkable in appearance, which had always been his greatest professional advantage. On the 6th morning after the crash, Crispin arrived for his duties and found the Duke watching him. Not with pain, not with the foggy helplessness that the medicine seemed designed to produce. With the expression Crispin had seen twice before, once before the Edinburgh incident and once before a business negotiation that had left 3 rivals without their shirts. It was the Duke's hunting face. Alaric said nothing. He looked at the brown bottle on the bedside table. He looked back at Crispin. Once. Slowly. Crispin understood immediately. He took the bottle to old Mr. Petch, the village chemist, presenting it as a request for a fresh supply. Petch examined it with the distracted efficiency of a man who has handled 10,000 bottles and knows them all by smell. Then he stopped. He held the bottle up to the light. He unstoppered it and applied one small drop to a strip of treated paper he kept for exactly such tests, the kind of test a careful man keeps available and prays he never needs. The paper turned a color it should not have turned. Patch set the bottle down carefully and looked at Crispin with the expression of a man who has just been handed a problem he did not ask for. He sent Crispin away, asked for an hour, and when Crispin returned, he slid a folded note across the counter without a word. It named 2 compounds. The first was laudanum, unremarkable. The second was an alkaloid extract from a colonial plant, known in certain disreputable medical circles as a patient means of ending a life. Administered in small, consistent doses over weeks, it produced progressive paralysis beginning in the lower limbs, mimicking spinal injury so convincingly that most physicians would never look further. In sufficient quantity, it killed. At the bottom of the note, in handwriting that shook slightly, Petch had written, "Someone is being murdered. Go to the law or answer for it." Crispin folded the note and put it in his pocket. He went back to Pembroke Manor and replaced the medicine with plain water darkened with a bitter herb that matched the color and smell near enough to pass. Within 3 days, feeling had returned to the Duke's feet. Within a week, Alaric could flex his legs beneath the bedclothes without visible movement. He tested it quietly each night after the house went dark, feeling strength return like the tide coming in, slow, inevitable, unstoppable. He performed his paralysis in daylight with the disciplined patience of a man who has decided that the only revenge worth pursuing is one that leaves nothing standing. Meanwhile, Crispin watched. He was gifted in invisibility in the way that only men who have spent decades being underestimated can be. He listened outside doors. He intercepted household correspondence under the guise of sorting the post, read the contents, resealed the letters with a steady hand, and delivered them without expression. What he brought to Alaric each night, whispered while appearing to arrange the bedside table, assembled into something that would have broken a lesser man. Isolde had retained a London solicitor,
The solicitor was preparing papers to have Alaric declared mentally and physically incompetent, a legal proceeding that, once blessed by a county bishop and witnessed by men of standing, would transfer full authority over the Pembroke estate, lands, investments, and title income to his surviving spouse, permanently. Lord Fenwick had been transferring funds from a secondary Pembroke account, small amounts timed to avoid notice, into a private holding registered under a false merchant's name. The transfers had been running for 4 months. The total was already considerable. Then Crispin produced the letter that changed everything. It was in Isolde's own handwriting, addressed to a wheelwright named Silas Grout in a village 40 miles north. It contained a receipt of payment, dated 2 days before the carriage crash, and a brief note of thanks for the work carried out as discussed and agreed, with full satisfaction. Silas Grout, according to the trade directory Crispin located, specialized in carriage repair, specifically ironwork, specifically axles. Alaric held the letter for a long moment. His face did not change. He folded it with precision and handed it back. "Everything," he said quietly. "Every letter, every receipt, every number. Keep all of it. And when the Duchess brings the medicine tonight, Your Grace." Alaric looked out at the Pembroke grounds, the stone walls, the bare winter trees, the iron gates that had borne his family name for 4 generations. All of it nearly taken. All of it nearly gone. "Smile at her," he said, "and thank her for her kindness." She arrived on a Tuesday morning in a gray wool coat that had been mended at both elbows, with a boy of 9 or 10 beside her who looked at the great iron gates of Pembroke Manor the way children look at things they have only ever heard described. She gave the groundskeeper no name. She said she had a matter of urgency for the Duke and that she would wait as long as necessary. The groundskeeper, uncertain, sent word to the house. Isolde received the message first. Crispin, stationed nearby as always, watched her read it. He watched the color fall from her face, not slowly, not gradually, but all at once, like a curtain dropping. He watched her crush the note in her fist and compose herself in under 5 seconds, which told him, more than anything else he had observed in 4 months, exactly how dangerous this woman was. "Tell her the Duke is gravely ill and cannot receive visitors," Isolde said in a voice of perfect smoothness, "and if she refuses to leave, send for the constable." Crispin nodded, walked to the gate, and told the woman nothing of the sort. He brought her in through the servants' entrance instead. Her name was Lady Rowena Ashby, and 10 years ago she had been the only woman Alaric Pembroke had ever intended to marry. He had met her at 28, before his title fully transferred, before the arrangement his father had constructed with the Beaumont family, before Isolde. Rowena had been the daughter of a minor country lord, clear-eyed and honest in a social world that considered both qualities slightly embarrassing. Alaric had told his father he meant to marry her. His father had told him, with the cold finality of a man who controls every shilling a younger son depends on, that he would marry Isolde Beaumont or he would be cut off entirely and left to discover what his principles were worth without a penny behind them. Alaric had chosen the estate, as men in his position always did, and 6 months after the wedding, a letter had arrived from Rowena's sister saying that Rowena had died of a sudden fever. He had locked himself in his study for 2 days and come out speaking of it to no one, ever. She had not died of any fever. She was standing before him now, thinner than he remembered, quieter in her bearing, with the particular stillness of a woman who has spent years managing grief in private. The lines at the corners of her eyes were ones that sorrow put there and time does not remove. And the boy beside her stood with his hands at his sides and looked at Alaric with a directness that startled him, because he was looking at his own jaw, his own brow, his own expression of calm assessment on the face of a child he had never known existed. Alaric looked at Rowena. She held his gaze without flinching, which was the most courageous thing he had ever witnessed anyone do. "His name is Jasper. He is yours. I thought you had the right to know. Whatever else has happened, and whatever you choose to do with it, that much I owed you." The room was absolutely silent. Isolde had gone to Rowena 6 months into the marriage. She had arrived with 2 men and an offer wrapped inside a threat. Leave England, never contact Alaric, tell your family you have died and you will be permitted to live. Stay, and the consequences would be arranged to look like misfortune. Rowena had been 3 months with child when she accepted those terms. She had gone to a cousin in the Scottish borders and raised Jasper alone in a house with mended elbows on every coat and a fire only large enough to be necessary. She had kept her silence because she had convinced herself that Alaric was settled, content, living well, that disrupting his life would only scatter ruin across everyone, most of all her son. It was Jasper who had ended her silence. The previous winter, with the directness available only to 9-year-olds, he had asked who his father was and whether his father knew about him. Rowena had no answer for either question that she could live with, so she had come. Alaric reached across and placed his hand over hers, the first deliberate movement he had ever made in front of another person since the crash, and said, "You should never have carried this alone." His voice was rough with something that had accumulated for 10 years and had no single name. Jasper was examining the bookshelves along the far wall with the focused concentration of a boy determining whether a room is worth his respect. He pulled one volume out an inch, pushed it back, moved to the next. Alaric watched him and felt something settle inside his chest, some long-carried weight finding the ground at last. "What happens now?" Rowena asked quietly. "Now," Alaric said, "I stand up and I end this."
Isolde had arranged the dinner for the 28th. 11 guests, 3 solicitors, 2 county lords, a bishop, a physician unconnected to the estate, 2 witnesses of unimpeachable reputation, and Lord Fenwick, who arrived 40 minutes early and took his seat at the far end of the table with the studied composure of a man who has calculated everything and found the numbers satisfying. The Pembroke silver was laid, the candles were lit, the wine was already breathing, and at the center of the long table Isolde had placed a single white lily, the flower customarily laid on coffins, a touch so brazen it was either careless or a declaration. Crispin, stationed near the service door, noted it without expression. Isolde welcomed her guests with the practiced warmth of a woman hosting a triumph she intends to wear as sorrow. She spoke of Alaric's decline in careful, compassionate sentences. She spoke of her duty to the estate, to its tenants, to the continuation of a legacy that could not be left in the hands of a man who could no longer manage his own name. She spoke of sacrifice and responsibility and the terrible weight of love that must sometimes make hard choices. Then she produced the documents. The solicitor had prepared them in London, bound neatly in brown cord. They were precise, thorough, and devastating. A legal declaration of incapacity, witnessed and sworn, transferring all Pembroke estate authority, lands, and income to the surviving spouse in full and permanent perpetuity. She laid them on the table before the bishop and uncapped her pen. "This is not a moment I sought," she said with a tremor in her voice calibrated to land just below the threshold of melodrama. "It is simply a moment I could no longer in good conscience defer." The bishop reached for his own pen. The doors at the far end of the room opened. Duke Alaric Pembroke walked in. He wore black with a white cravat and the Pembroke signet ring on his right hand. He walked without assistance, no cane, no arm, no hesitation, at the unhurried pace of a man who has decided that his entrance is the last thing anyone in this room will ever forget. His eyes found Isolde first and held. She had gone the color of old ash. Her pen was suspended in midair. Her mouth had opened slightly and produced no sound. The table was completely silent. "Please," Alaric said pleasantly, drawing out the chair at the true head of the table, "do not stop on my account." He sat. He straightened his cuffs. He looked at the assembled guests with the mild, attentive expression of a man who has arrived at a meeting he had been anticipating for some time. Then he reached into his coat. He placed 3 items on the table. The first was Mr. Petch's written analysis of the medicine bottle, signed, witnessed, and sealed.
It named the compound, described its effects, and estimated that at the dosage administered, death would have been expected within 40 days. The second was Isolde's letter to Silas Grout, the wheelwright, her own handwriting, her own seal, the payment receipt dated 2 days before the carriage went over the gorge. The third was a sworn statement from Crispin Ware, 19 years in service, witnessed before the county magistrate the previous afternoon. It detailed every intercepted letter, every overheard conversation, every sum transferred by Lord Fenwick from the Pembroke accounts over 4 months. The total was listed at the bottom. The bishop made a small sound when he read it. Alaric said nothing. He let the document speak. Then he looked at the bishop and said simply, "I believe you were preparing to sign something, Your Eminence. I would ask you to read those first." Lord Fenwick rose from his chair. The 2 men standing at the service entrance, constables who had been briefed that afternoon by the county magistrate himself and had been waiting with professional patience, moved forward without urgency and stood on either side of him. Fenwick looked at the constables. He sat back down. Isolde did not flee. She was not built for flight. She stood at the head of the table with her chin lifted and her eyes moving from the documents to Alaric, to the constables, and back, calculating with the speed of a woman who has never been caught before and cannot quite accept that she is caught now. She was looking for the move that saved her. There was no such move. The letters were in her handwriting. The wheelwright, when visited by the magistrate's man the previous week, had provided a full account in exchange for a reduced charge. Dr. Stowell had already confessed in writing from his cell in the village, where he had been since the previous evening. The room had closed around her with the completeness of a well-set trap, because it was exactly that. She looked at Alaric across the length of the table, across the silver and the candles and the lilies she had placed there herself, and said, very quietly, "You were supposed to be dead." "Yes," Alaric said, "you were very thorough." He held her gaze until she looked away, which she did, finally, after a long moment. "I was simply more patient," he said. Isolde and Lord Fenwick were taken from Pembroke Manor before midnight. The solicitor's documents were burned in the dining-room fireplace by the bishop personally, who appeared to feel the gesture was necessary for his own peace of mind. The physician packed his bag and left without being asked. The witnesses dispersed into the cold November night with the subdued manner of men who have attended something they will never discuss in polite company. Stowell's confession made the legal proceedings straightforward. Grout, the wheelwright, testified in full before the county court 3 weeks later. Fenwick's false accounts were traced by Alaric's London solicitors within a fortnight, and every transferred pound recovered with interest. The annulment was granted on grounds that required very little argument.
The Pembroke estate went quiet in a way it had not been for years. Rowena and Jasper remained in the West Wing while the legal questions settled themselves. Jasper spent his mornings following the head groundskeeper across the estate with the focused intensity of a boy deciding which parts of a place belonged to him. He asked questions that were sharper than they had any right to be for someone his age. He ate well, slept soundly, and showed no inclination to be impressed by wealth, while being quietly impressed by everything. Alaric found that watching his son was the least painful part of everything that had happened. It was, in fact, the only part that felt entirely new. On the last evening of November, Alaric stood at the study window with a glass of brandy he had not drunk, looking out at the Pembroke grounds in the dark, the old yews bending in the wind, the stone walls, the gate with the family crest in iron above the arch. Crispin appeared in the doorway. "The boy asks if you might take him to the North Road tomorrow," he said. "He wants to see the gorge. He says he has heard about it." The North Road, the place where the axle had cracked and the carriage had fallen, and someone had decided his life was worth less than his land. He had not been back. Alaric was quiet for a moment. "Tell him yes," he said, "and tell him to wear his heavy coat. The wind comes off the moor like judgment up there."
Crispin's mouth moved in the small, private smile of a man who has served someone for 19 years and is glad that number will keep growing. He withdrew and pulled the door softly shut. Alaric turned from the window. The fire was warm, the manor was his. His enemies were answering for what they had done in the only courtroom that had ever mattered to him, the one where evidence speaks and status does not. And somewhere down the corridor his son was asleep in a house that would one day carry